Hey everyone, and welcome to the 112th edition of DF Direct Weekly. As usual, this is our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. I'm back in the office and ready to talk tech. And joining me, first of all, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, it's less colorful this week. You've replaced that yellow background of your Airbnb with red there. Which is not bad.
I'll tell you what, I love that supervillain chair though, with a weed. It's just awesome. And of course, Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, I'm in the unchanging room. Everything stays the same, just collects dust. And I'm excited to talk about all the tech topics this week.
Are you really excited though, Alex?
A bit, like 60%.
Yeah, I'm
excited, but also genuinely scared.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on to that first news topic. And Alex, we're going to be revisiting one of your low points of the year. Star Wars Jedi Survivor on PC. It's received multiple patches at this point, each proclaiming that there are performance improvements. And new patch, quote unquote, dropped yesterday. You've got some stress test data here to share with us, right? The question is, has it been fixed?
Okay, so to answer the simple question, no, it has not been fixed. It still has the very similar profile overall of performance. And the big issue with Jedi Survivor, if you just go back to that original video that I had, it's mainly that CPU performance is really pretty low, even on the lowest settings. And the stability of that performance is the really big negative part of the game, where just moving around the game world induces hitching and stuttering and erratic frame times on all CPUs, really. It's just like the most high-end CPUs, they still have those stutters, but because the base frame time is lower, they're not as spiky on the frame time graph. That's about it. You can still notice them, obviously. That's the whole point. So the patch, when looking at this footage right here, you'll see a couple things. One, on average, the average frame rate is 2% higher over the entire run. And that's some of it's down to variance because the end part of the run runs a little bit better in the older patch, apparently. But there is some noticeable things. Some of the areas where the spiky hitches occur, they are less spiky. But you can see other areas, due to the variance between runs and things like that, where the spikes are actually higher in the new patch, running over the same area. But the averages don't lie, at least. It is at least 2% faster.
2% faster than what? Than the last patch? Or
than the last patch, which would make it, I don't know, in total like 11 to 12% faster than the original launch version, I believe, which is not bad overall, I think, or it could even be a little bit higher than that. But that's not bad overall. That's definitely an improvement to praise. But the issue that I don't show in this video right here is that I did have to do 3 runs. Actually, this is the third run of me running through this area between the new patch. Because what I do is I load up the game after a new patch. It does the PSO pre-compilation step. And then I go into the game at the save location and I run through this area, which is how I do it. But I have to do it multiple times to ensure that there's the least amount of PSO stutters in between runs, because the first time you load up an area, and if you do a run through it, you'll still see some stutters that won't happen the second or maybe third time you run through it. So they still haven't gotten down some of the core basics of the game, that the game can still have PSO stutters even with the PSO pre-compilation step. And to me, that is this is all fixable stuff, but maybe they're waiting to have a good PSO cache until they actually finish the game. I have no idea. It's weird, but overall here, I would say Jedi Survivor is still not fixed. It's better, but it's still not fixed. Maybe you can have a little bit more stability there, but the core issues are still there. There's still shader compilation stutters. There's still hitching when traversing the train. And I also experienced a very hilarious moment when I got in the menu where in the original video, I complained that you can't quit the game while using a mouse, but you can quit it with a keyboard stroke. Well, I discovered that you can't change resolution and a number of other graphical options with a controller. The accept, start, A buttons, whatever, they don't allow you to accept changes in the menu. I had to hit spacebar. Not even enter. It's like different. The menus are just a mess. So yeah, Jedi Survivor still requires more patches for performance. on PC.
The next patch is going to require Kinect voice control to change the options.
Yeah.
I've been looking at your data actually while you were talking about that, and basically what you're seeing is iterative improvements, patch on patch, right? Which I guess is all we can really expect, but it doesn't really address the issue, which is a foundational issue that the streaming system just isn't really fit for purpose, really.
No, it isn't at all.
That's kind of the bottom line, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think the only really sort of interesting or salient tip I could give to users is to find a performance hotspot like that, and then basically adjust a frame rate cap down and down until the stutter becomes kind of livable. That would be my strategy for sorting it. But man, that's not great, is it?
I agree with that completely. And in fact, if you go to performance, like I was looking at the Reset Era performance thread before I came in here, and you look at all the posts in there, and they're all about mitigating like expectations. They're all like, well, I set the game to a 30 FPS cap and it feels better. Or I set the game to a 40 FPS cap and it feels 90% better. Or people also mitigating expectations by downloading. There's a very interesting mod by someone, I think their name is Pure Dark, that has been modding in DLSS 3 frame generation into games, which is very cool. But I think this requires a subscription or to their Patreon maybe to get access to it. But basically people are saying there, well, if I lock the game at 60 or 80 FPS with frame gen, I get a better experience. Well, if you're doing that, you're actually, the internal rendering of the game is either 30 or 40 at that point.
Yeah.
So they're doing the same thing, but they're getting a better visual experience. And maybe because they're also adding in reflex, which the game does not support, maybe they're actually getting better input latency than the default game at a higher refresh rate, which is interesting. So,
well, this is all very interesting, isn't it?
Gosh.
Because I don't think. Well, I guess Nvidia did actually anticipate the idea that DLSS 3 would be used to overcome CPU limits, right? But they didn't anticipate that CPU implementations in recent titles would be so bad that DLSS 3 would be used as a crutch.
yeah.
And what DLSS 3 is essentially doing is what I've pretty much described, which is to implement a low frame rate cap that keeps things consistent. And it just sort of is interpolating frames in between there. I find this quite fascinating. It's maybe even worth a video, really. Because, I'm looking at mid-range PCs at the moment. I'm looking at a PC with a 13400F.
Good.
And, Hogwarts Legacy, Hogsmeade is like 40 FPS, a minimum. With everything maxed. I mean, I've got a 4070 in there and it's basically idling for the most part with full RT active. So I think there's actually a really interesting use case scenario here, but I don't like it in the fact that we're using DLSS 3 as a sticking plaster of sorts to mitigate poor CPU implementations. But we talked about this last week with you, John, on Redfall, where you did exactly the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. It did help a lot in the case of Redfall. The thing with games like this, just listening to you guys talk about this, I'm just the state of this situation with this game. Like Alex, like let's say you really wanted to play this game. I know I do. I'm actually waiting for the moment, but
it's a good game.
Could you even enjoy it at this point? Like it's been out for almost a month. Like it's a mess. Like it feels like having to go through it with this fine-tooth comb over and over again. Oh no, it's still bad. Like it feels like that just squashes any potential enjoyment you might get out of it, especially for like an experience-based like single-player game, right?
Yeah.
Like, could you even enjoy it at this point, or is it like destroyed the game?
So it's interesting. It does actually take away a bit of the magic of it, because the game, obviously, like that Metroid Prime-esque or Metroid-esque is about like discovering new areas and enjoying this sense of discovery and like this learning of the branching like nature of the world there. And every single time you've gone to a new area in this game, it always has induced stutter. So it's not like you're like constantly ripped out of the moment of the Metroid-esque nature of this world by stutter. And it actually has ruined it a lot.
That's what I thought.
And obviously the rote routine of loading up a new patch and testing to see the differences and then just being disappointed is also a really dour thing to enjoying the game, because I just keep testing the same area to make sure it's better. I'm not playing the game, obviously, at that point.
Right. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that sucks. And this whole thing just ties in with this game specifically. I actually did sit down and listen to the IGN interview with Stig Asmussen. If I said that right, I hope. Basically the game's director. And just the way they talked made it sound like, we're ready. We got this thing polished up. We wanted to avoid any issues like the last game. That's why we got the 6-week delay. So just hearing him talk about it from that perspective and then seeing what actually came out, I'm just flabbergasted by the situation. And I cannot believe that it is like this. And myself, I really want to play this game. It was very high on my hype list, but I can't. I'm just waiting for it right now. Like, I just don't feel like it's in a state where I want to touch it. And maybe it'll never be smooth and I'll just have to deal with it. I don't know. It feels like such a bummer for all that hard work that went into this game to basically be spoiled by issues like this.
Yeah, it is a shame. And I also think in regards to the DLSS 3 situation, which is just a bandage over a wound, it is a shame that the game didn't launch with DLSS 2 or 3 on PC as well.
Oh, wait, is this AMD sponsored?
It's one of those AMD sponsored games.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah, of course.
That's what happens.
But, I think in this case, people having to resort once again to doing like weirdo mods, like with Resident Evil 4's remake that I also talked about, like how you're getting a better image quality experience for most objects, like most scenes in the game, by using a user mod. And that seems like really weird.
Unacceptable. It's not acceptable, man.
Yeah.
Like, it just... Ugh.
Well, the concept of having to patch it in to get a smooth experience is quite remarkable, really. You have to rely on the modding community to actually get this thing into shape. John, have you considered playing the console version at 30 FPS? Because, it seems to be all right there.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is, even on the console, it's still not great, or it hasn't been. We still need to test this new patch. I'm willing to play it on the console at 30 FPS, I suppose, but... I was also hoping that these patches would improve that version as well, and maybe it did. None of us have had a chance to test the new patch that just dropped, right? So I will try it myself and see how it fares. But even the thing that bummed me out is, like, even on the consoles at 30 FPS, it definitely did feel pretty good, I would say, but there's still drops below 30 FPS at points, and I'm just like how? And there's stuttering spots, and it's just... Ah, man, it's a bummer.
Yeah, I think for me, like, you could just do a 30 FPS cap on PC and, get a similar console-like experience. But, sorry, my throat is just acting up right now. But that's such a mitigating, like, we've seen games look better.
Wait, Alex,
and run better.
Your throat, is that like a forced choke? Perhaps?
Yeah, it is.
This is truly the Jedi Survivor.
Yeah, an entire like the dev team is now choking me long
They're
distance.
like, oh no,
how dare
I'm
you?
sorry, I love this game. It's great.
It's great. But I think just having all this PC power, let alone all the power that the consoles have, and having to do this to make it run well is always a bit sad. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, there's a massive underutilization issue here, not just on the CPU side, because, well, the CPU runs the show, right? So if the CPU is underutilized, then your GPU's basically sitting there
doing nothing.
Yeah, idling, I think is I wouldn't say that's probably an exaggeration, right? But it's not being utilized to anything like the degree it should be. I mean, it would be quite amusing just to, see whether the 4090 could just run it at 8K native.
Do it.
Just to give the GPU something to do.
I know, Rich. I always love to bring this up, but it reminds me of when the Forza Horizon 5 patch dropped with the ray tracing features, and I tested it on the 4090, and there was points where the fan on the card actually stopped because it was so underutilized that it didn't even need the fan at points. It just sitting there like twiddling its thumbs, like that is an easy workout.
Yeah, and again, going back to DLSS 3, using that feature is essentially enforcing further underutilization in order to get a smoother experience. What kind of world are we living in? This is nuts.
This is bad times. Bad times.
Crazy stuff. I mean, just to go back to that data again, look, it's basically parallel lines, right? Each new patch is improving baseline performance, except the issue is still there, right? Which is that every time you're moving into a new area, it's streaming in data and that's what's causing the issue. And it looks as though they've made attempts to mitigate it, but the attempts are just a mitigation when it's basically a core problem with the game that needs fully addressed.
And I'm really interested if they address it in a complete sense, given the amount of lashback against this game, the amount of
backlash.
I don't know if that's backlash. I have bad.
I like that lashback.
Backlash against the game. That was what do they call those? Spoonerisms. That's right. One of those. Given that situation, it'd be really interesting if they did fix it, because I think it would be one of the first times we've ever seen a title on Unreal Engine 4 after having a traversal stutter issue actually ever fix it. And I almost feel like this could tie back into a larger industry question of there needs to be maybe more dedicated knowledge and resource sharing regarding engines like Unreal Engine 4 in terms of best practices. Because this is not the first time we've seen this issue. Both of the issues, PSO stutter and traversal stutter in the engine. And it's almost like organically grown over social media of people talking about this. But it still is kind of there's not a lot of like a shared knowledge repository regarding experiences with Unreal Engine.
It does seem to be somewhat terminal for some of these games due to like decisions made early in development, right? Like, so actually completely eliminating the problem may not even be possible.
Yeah, good point.
So that's kind of the concern. And also all the discussion around this shader compilation stuff and various other traversal stutters and all that, that's stuff that's really sort of bubbled up in the last couple of years, thanks especially to us and especially Alex.
Thank you.
All of the games launching with these problems have been in development for far longer than that. And if some of the problems are in fact deeply rooted in decisions made early in the project, I can see why it would be so difficult to solve. But I hope that all these conversations happening now do have an influence on games that will release in the future. So that's the hope anyway.
That's what I hope.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the next news topic. And looking at the docket, what we're going to discuss is the recent announcement of Nvidia's 60 class cards. Two of them are coming. We've got an RTX 4060 that is going to launch at $299. That's actually cheaper than the 3060, which is, to quote Palpatine, a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. And then we have the 4060 Ti, which is $399. So again, the same price as 3060 Ti. And that's going to be coming soon, and reviews should be imminent on that. Alex, thoughts on these cards?
Wow.
I mean, I've actually, just to give you a bit of perspective here, there was a tweet from I think it's 3dcenter.org. They're projecting, based on Nvidia's own numbers, there was various benchmarks that appeared in their press materials. They're saying it's going to be 18% faster than the 3060, which is not as fast as a 3060 Ti, but a reasonable improvement. 4060 Ti, 13% faster than 3060 Ti, so they're projecting that it won't be as fast as a 3070. But at the same time, the prices are okay. You're going to get DLSS 3. They're going to be efficiency beasts. It's kind of like, I guess, it's the era of the side grade, isn't it, Alex? Where iterative improvements from cards from 3 years ago, and there's a lot of emphasis in the marketing on DLSS 3 to actually make those bar charts longer.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, oh, there's a lot to say here. I think the side grade is a really great point, because you go back in time and you look at the 70 series or the 60 series, gen on gen, and I think the 1060 is just an incredible example of that, where it's almost like between a 970 and a 980, but it's like, right? Isn't it?
It's
like
a 980. It's basically very, very close to a 980 with 2 gigs more RAM. So yeah, that,
right?
Pascal was just a phenomenal
the old high end. It's like faster than the old step before the 980 Ti. So the other high end. That's so good for a mid-range GPU at the price point it was at. The 2060, a bit of a slight of a side grade situation, not in terms of I think it's much powerful from a shading perspective, obviously, but the VRAM situation wasn't changed much, but you had a much a future looking feature set there. And then you go to 3060, where it was obviously a card that was saved at some point pre-launch by, it was originally probably going to be 6 gigabytes, and then they thought, oh my god, we'll be crucified if we do this. So it came out as a 12 gigabyte card, which arguably maybe a little bit too much memory for the amount of power you're given. It allows the card to have more utility, which is a really great part of actually. So I would always recommend someone buying a GPU to get as much VRAM as possible. That was the interesting part about that GPU. It came out with a good price. Obviously, we have the whole stock situation there, ruining the prices of all GPUs, but it was actually a pretty okay GPU, I think, at the end of things.
It's basically a 2070 with more RAM.
I think that's great. I think that's actually pretty great. Then we get to this here, and the prices are okay. Like, they're okay for that 8 gigabyte model in terms of just like how much money you're giving out in general. But at this point in time, 8 gigabytes, this is a whole other question in itself, but you're buying a card in the year 2023 with 8 gigabytes. And what that means is that it is a loss of utility for the GPU, and it also means more headaches for the user. So buying a GPU should hopefully mean that Nvidia with their GPU is taking care of a lot of the problems for the user. They want to do that either with its feature set. They want to offer you a good experience. If you buy a GPU and due to the amount of VRAM it has, it means in every new release that is going to come out, you're going to have to go into the menu and make sure you're setting your settings right, even at 1080p. That means you're you're just giving the user more headaches than they need. Like this last year, and even at the end of last year, games have come out where, yes, they should obviously look and run a lot better on 8 gigabyte GPUs, as we'll talk about soon enough on another topic. But the thing is, the point is they're launching in a level. This is the new way things are done. Games are launched in a level where scaling is atrocious, CPU performance is awful, and the user is the one left to defend themselves. And if you have the high-end power in terms of VRAM and a really fast clocked CPU, you're in a much better state than someone who has less VRAM and a mid-range CPU. And in this case, this GPU is not upgrading in that core feature over the last generation, and it is just going to lead to so many more user headaches than would be necessary if they just did an entirely different memory configuration in general. I think the choice between 8 and 16 gigabytes is an awful choice for the user.
Yeah.
It's too much. 16 is arguably maybe too much for these, especially for the base 3060s.
I don't think the 4060 is getting a 16 gig variant.
Oh no, that's awful.
It's the 4060 Ti.
Oh no, okay. Well, then that's even worse. This 4060 Ti then, like 16 is a lot. I think 12 would have been really perfect for this GPU actually, and it would have brought the price down probably to a level where I would say, yeah, that's maybe a reasonable buy, but.
I think we need to explain why that's not possible. It's basically the configuration of the memory interface. It's a 128-bit bus, which effectively in real terms means that they can do, 4, 8, or 16 gigabytes. They can't do 12 without doing some crazy stuff, which would actually make the memory slower.
Still, while that may be true, that doesn't change the fact that it's not a great product in 2023. And in fact, the biggest problem I see is that 8 gigabytes of VRAM has become a problem in all recent games, but that's just recent stuff. This problem is not going to get better, right? People buy a graphics card, and I would assume that most people would like to get at least like 3 years out of their card, right?
Yeah.
Maybe more. Like, you don't buy a card to then upgrade the next year. And actually, the people that do that typically are those that would buy the ultra high end ones anyway, right? So like, I feel like they're just setting this card up for long-term failure. It's not a good long-term solution. Well,
what's going to happen is basically you're going to be pushed down onto medium textures, which may look okay, which may not look okay. I think Nvidia are positioning both of these cards for 1080p gamers, which I don't think that's a good idea. No. If you look at the 4060 Ti, assuming it is like 13% more powerful than a 3060 Ti, you're getting way more rasterization performance than a PS5. you're getting a lot more ray tracing performance than a PS5. You've got machine learning silicon in there. It's basically a really, on paper at least, this is a fantastic GPU for the mainstream. It's just going to be held back by that 8 gigabyte frame buffer because unless we see really special care and attention from developers, there's a couple of things that are going to happen. First of all, you're not going to be able to have texture quality as good as the PlayStation 5, which is, depending on how it's implemented, can be game-changing or not. The thing that concerns me more is the fact that people think about resolution and textures as being the main things that affect the frame buffer, right? And that's true to a certain extent, but we're moving into the ray tracing era, right? BVH structures are going to be the same regardless of resolution, right, Alex?
Yeah, they should be. They shouldn't change. Yeah.
I mean, you can conceivably reduce the quality of the BVH structure to lower the VRAM requirements there, but there's more pressure being added on to the 8 gigabyte cards there. And then at the same time, what we're seeing with Xbox Series S is what happens when you do have a limiting factor on VRAM and it's, no ray tracing and big reductions in texture quality, which are easily noticeable. That is not the future that I want for a 3060 Ti owner, right? 3060, 299, it should have been a 12 gig card, and Nvidia has essentially validated that approach by making the 3060 a 12 gig card. So to actually reduce the value in that key respect, gen on gen, is not a good look, and specifically because the audience aren't going to understand the implications of memory bus versus available VRAM. And I've got to say, there is a good approach being taken. Well, in theory, a good approach with the 4060 Ti to offer a 16 gigabyte variant. Because, in theory, it's like, okay, well, I'm aware of this issue. I don't want to be bothered by it. I will pay a bit more to have more frame buffer memory. Unfortunately, it's not a bit more. It's $100 more.
Yeah.
It's an entirely different class of GPU at that point.
Yeah, basically, at that point, it's 3070 money. And based on these projections from 3dcenter.org, which may or may not be true, you're not getting 3070 class performance. Maybe you will in certain titles or whatever. Ada is quite an interesting architecture in how it compares to Ampere. But, I'm looking at that $500 4060 Ti, and then I'm eyeing the $600 4070, which, no doubt about it, is going to be a much faster card. And it won't have 16 gigs of memory, it'll have 12 gigs of memory, but you make the trade and you think, which one shall I buy? And it really does look, by making that $500 card, it's putting the user into a scenario where they're considering, it could be, the danger is it could be viewed as an upsell, right?
Yeah,
where it's like,
arguably we're seeing that across the range, right? Somebody's like, well, I'll get this 4060, and it's like, I could get the Ti for $100 more, and you're like, but then if I just spent another $100, then I get like 16 gigs of VRAM. Oh, but then it's like really close to the 3070. Maybe I should just chill out. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah,
that's what it feels like. And that's actually how I might think of a product like this, foolishly or not, but where it's like each one feels like a stone's throw to the next level. And it's all about solving potential problems. You're like, well, if I just spend a little bit more here, then I'll get this. And it all kind of feels like an upsell.
How much does an extra 8 gigs of memory cost? That is the question. And can it be justified by a $100 price hike? I'd love to hear some numbers on this, but I suspect, $450 would have been doable. And then that solves the entire problem, doesn't it? Just solves the entire issue of...
It would have been an amazing GPU actually at $450, because you're looking at outclassing the consoles in every aspect of performance, as well as, having those future features and potentially even higher resolution textures than consoles. That 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti could have been an amazing GPU at a lower price point, actually.
Obviously we've got to review the thing ourselves and see how it all checks out. But, I'm just going to say what I told Nvidia when we had the briefing, which is that, the 3070 at the moment is my go-to card for testing a new release, right? Because it's better than, ray tracing performance way ahead of the consoles. Shading performance, rasterization, it's a good chunk ahead of the consoles. I shouldn't have any problem running a console port. But, you know, Forspoken was a total mess. The Last of Us Part 1 was a total mess. I haven't even bothered looking at Jedi Survivor. Hogwarts Legacy was a stutterfest. And guess what? I swap in a 2080 Ti, which is essentially the same level of performance but has more memory. All of these problems go away. And I've got a big stack of GPUs behind me here. I can make this problem go away, but the average user can't until the developer goes back and then patches and improves and iterates. And you actually see that, I suspect, in the 4060 Ti benchmarks that will come out, where actually I reckon it will benchmark just fine. And I suspect that's what Nvidia's figures are showing too, right? Even on stuff like T-Loop 1, because, weeks after the release, months after the release, they're in a reasonable state on 8GB cards.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, right? Which is that, the day one experience, you don't want your GPU to let you down, and that's the scenario we're facing here. But Alex, the T-Loop 1 experience is quite fascinating because you've got a video out now that actually shows that it's fine on an 8GB card.
Yeah, it's very different
now. It is
in its launch position, and there's a lot of parts about this. I think so. The original version of the game showed me how a PC port should not scale in terms of memory configuration. When you turn on the settings there for video memory related things, specifically in regards to textures, it would just make the game look really, really bad. I'm pretty sure it actually did have lower resolution textures than the original PS3 release in some areas. I'm not going to lie about that. I'm pretty sure it did.
I don't think that's up for debate, really, is it, John?
Yeah. No.
It was hideous. The initial release of T-Loop 1 on PC, texture quality was lower than PS3.
I wouldn't doubt that.
Making those comparisons to the original T-Loop, it was shockingly bad, unacceptable. And I would say anybody that purchased it would probably not have enjoyed playing it that way because it basically destroyed the artwork,
It did. That was the situation at launch. And now that was what I would call bad video memory scaling. Now they've done two things, it looks like. And it is so interesting. And it shows how good video memory scaling should work. I really think it should always be a question of how big of the texture cache is for streaming. And the quality of the textures should be changeable as well. You should be able to change how big the cache is as well as how high quality those textures are. And that's essentially the options you have now. You have an option which controls the quality of the base textures themselves, and then another option, and they're called texture streaming rate, which changes the size of cache, which also, as a function of that, makes it so that streaming has to occur more often since the cache is smaller. And when you turn the camera, it will need to load in more textures, while as in a larger cache, you would turn the camera and the textures would have already been there in the cache anyway, so it doesn't matter. But these two functions that they broke out is really cool because it gives us an insight in how you can scale a game on VRAM on PC in a good way. Now, for one, on the side of that, they've also just generally, it looks like there's just entirely different textures when you select the medium setting. Like they don't look anything like the old textures do at any point. It's really, really interesting. Either it means they reauthored these textures, as in they made a new downsample of the original textures for medium, which is a possibility. Or maybe the way they had the previous system set up, maybe those textures actually never showed up in the first place, even though the game had them on disk.
That's what, to me, it felt like when we were doing that comparison video, that some of those textures, it was like a texture way down the MIP chain, that it was just like, it was just stopping there, and that's all you were going to see.
Yeah, it's one of two of those situations, both of which are obviously not good.
No.
So that's the way it was, and now it is much better in that regard. But also because now they have this really wonderful texture streaming rate setting. If you have you could probably even get really incredible textures on a 6 or 4 gigabyte GPU now, based with the new system, I imagine, the way things work. I think that's the way it is. Like you can just really control really, really well when you see new textures of a higher quality. And it's so good. It's so good. I almost wish every game had it. You kind of get hints of it in the RE engine games where they have like a high, medium, and low setting, and then like 0.5 to up to 8 gigabytes for the cache setting, but they don't break it out in a way that is really user visible as well as The Last of Us is doing it now. And also it has like behavior that is really inexplicable, as I showed in my video for Resident Evil 4. But this is really great, and it just shows the situation, how a game should launch. The Last of Us Part 1 on PC should have been this way at launch, but it wasn't. So the 8 gigabyte user experience at launch was awful. It was just awful, and that's why I said don't play the game at all.
Unplayable, yeah.
Unplayable, and this is the situation I imagine to go forward, and why the 4060 8 gigabyte and 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte to me seems so untenable to launch in 2023, because at this point in time, we just cannot trust developers to make good experiences that scale on PC. It just there's been like 7 releases or something like that have issues in some manner. And
can we give a quick shout out again here to Dead Island 2, by the way? Damn Busters.
Well.
Those guys, that game is shockingly well made. Not to discount what they did, but it's like compared to every other Unreal Engine game being released, like this thing comes out even after all changing hands multiple times, it's impressively solid. So
well done there. And that's my core point about the 4060 and 4060 Ti, is that you just can't be guaranteed a good experience anymore due to the way games are released these days, and that is not a great buying opportunity for me anymore.
Theoretically, 8 gigabytes could be sufficient.
It should be great.
It should be sufficient, but it's not in our reality, and that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we've proven, Alex, or you've demonstrated, and I think Naughty Dog has demonstrated, that if you put in a lot of development resource, you can scale a PlayStation 5 experience down to an 8 gigabyte GPU in a graceful way, right?
It's great looking.
So that addresses the texture side of things. Nvidia have also put out a blog post about VRAM optimization technologies with ray tracing and whatnot.
I saw that.
I just don't, I looked at that and I thought, in a world where Jedi Survivor can ship in the state it is, T-Loop 1 for that matter, are these guys, in what level of priority are these technologies going to be integrated into PC games? There needs to be a fundamental shift in the way PC users are being treated at the moment, because they are second-class citizens. But at the same time, right, as we move further into this generation, we've got to accept that the consoles are the baseline. Right. And the acceptable baseline is PlayStation 5 and Series X. We're starting to see already sort of, Series S veers into the unacceptable baseline with some of the things that we're seeing. No ray tracing, reduced textures, reduced performance. That's kind of okay for a box that you buy in its entirety for $299 and for a more casual user. The thing about the PC is, it's got to be the same or better. Now, if we consider the 60 class components, right, 1060 wipes the floor with PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in its time, right?
Yeah.
And the 3060, it's, use DLSS, and you can actually get games that are pretty close to PlayStation 5. You're losing a bit on rasterization performance, but at the same time, you can render at 1080p up to 4K with DLSS. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the thing that's going to be missing with the 4060, is that you're kind of going to be reliant on the developer to actually maximize and more efficiently use the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and all bets may well be off on ray tracing support once that really takes off. Yeah, so I'm just my thoughts going into this one. It's going to benchmark okay, because benchmarks are typically run on mature games, and all of the issues, well, a great many of the issues on the problem games of 2023 have been fixed. But the question is, are those problems going to get better or worse year after year? And how long do you expect this GPU to last? I think it's a miscalculation. It's going to look really bad if we look at these 3D center numbers and assume that they've done the maths correctly. A 3060 with 12 gigs could perform quite a lot better than a 4060 with 8, assuming that it's got 18% more compute power but has to be straddled with 8 gigs of frame buffer memory. It's, I can kind of understand why they did it. I think it's difficult to explain to the end user for the 4060. 4060 Ti, $400 GPU with 8 gigs of memory is massively problematic. And yeah, that's going to be the issue going forward, I think. And the $500 alternative isn't really an alternative. It's just way too much money. I was kind of shocked by that. But, well, let's take some supporter questions on this. This one from Beth Stalvey. Recently, Nvidia released a paper about neural texture compression, which has implications that we could massively decrease VRAM requirements in games while maintaining quality. They posted the render times as 1.15 milliseconds for a 4K NTC image versus 0.49 milliseconds for a traditional BC texture. Do you think this could be some upcoming secret source for Ada Lovelace or possibly something for future GPUs? And this is from a slightly concerned 4070 owner. Alex, I mean, this looks to me like a proof of concept, right? And it needs to be integrated into a game, first of all, and then it needs to become some kind of staple component of game development to actually get mainstream buy-in, right?
Yeah, it's once again, like, this is really amazing technology. Proof of concept is important to point out because that 1.15 milliseconds is on an RTX 4090. It's going to be much higher on things with less tensor ops. So that's pretty important to point out. That's part of it. It needs to have the model be reduced and optimized in a way to make it more performant on a mainstream tensor capable GPU in the first place, kind of like DLSS. Start off like when they talked about the development of DLSS, both 2 and 3, the model size and complexity went down and more optimized over time because that's what they did. So it needs that first. And another part of this is that, yes, they can use this to reduce the footprint or keep the footprint similar to before at a higher quality. But do developers do that? Or do they use that new footprint and increase the quality even further? And I think in the past, it's been shown that when developers have the opportunity to fill more RAM, then they always do. So I don't know if that's a good thing in the first place. I would see this right now, and also the fact that this would be limited to Nvidia GPUs in the current model of things, because the other ones, other than Intel, AMD doesn't have any really good machine learning performance on their consumer level GPU sent to the market with the type of machine learning that this is doing. So it'd be NVIDIA only at that point, and it would maybe work its way into a handful of games. It doesn't have like that DLSS level of like.
Are we looking at like a sort of profound change to authoring of textures? Because if so, it's not going to happen, is it, realistically?
Realistically, it would require a different authoring of textures, which once again throws a wrench into the plan of this becoming some sort of widespread thing in the meantime. Maybe in a couple, like 5 years. The one thing was, we're still at this point where the things that can use the Tensor Core really well are limited to things that can only run in a specific vendor extension through Vulkan or through CUDA on NVIDIA. You're looking at things that do not generalize to the rest of the market. So it requires the developer to spend the time to do that. Most developers don't do that other than for DLSS, which is now just a plugin. So it would need to become a plugin to become useful, and it's currently not that. But this is cool future tech. This is really cool future tech.
Okay. I've got another question here from Alexander Seidel. Considering how much money people are willing to spend on graphics cards, maybe also because of an aging demographic, should NVIDIA just not try to stretch their usual numbered lineup anymore and announce a new lineup of enthusiast GPUs for the $1,500 to $3,000 euro range? They've done that already. We've got, the 3090 Ti was a $2,000 card.
Oh my gosh.
Basically what has happened is exactly this. The top tier pricing has crept up. It's kind of stopped with Ada, $1,500, $1,600 US. Absolutely, they could probably charge more, and they probably will when a 4090 Ti comes out, right? Mm-hmm. But I do wonder, right? What if the 4090 Ti had been a Titan 4090 had been a Titan? What if the 4080 had been a 4090? And then you just change because the power of a name is quite big. You probably come unstuck when we get to the 4060 series, where there's only a mooted, 13 to 18% change in performance. But yeah, I do wonder whether a lot of this is the power of the name and comparing names gen on gen. I don't know.
I've seen this brought around before, but due to the die size, people are saying actually the 4070 is a 4060. And, I think that is actually a powerful, in terms of what it is relatively, obviously not in terms of market conditions, but it is that in terms of the raw size.
It's basically the name of the processor, right? I mean, this is the first time I think the 60 class has been on the 107 class processor.
It's always a 6.
So, it's usually the 6. So, yeah, things are changing primarily because the cost of the node is so huge. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think they should be increasing GPU prices though. And I think, that's the one sort of saving grace of the 60 Ti. Well, there's a number of things. Obviously, there's the efficiency, there's DLSS3, and the pricing is static. And in the case of the 4060, it's back down to 299, which was what the 1060 was looking back. I've also ran some inflation numbers. 2016's 299 is now $377.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. So yeah, crazy stuff, right? I don't really know what else there is to say about this, except we've got to take a look at these GPUs as they come and see, how they're going to shake out. And I do think it is going to work out just fine on the benchmarks because, you're looking at games that are mature.
Exactly.
But it's the games that of the future that concern me. It's the future-proof element of it. It's basically I'm sort of concerned that the 60 class was always better than the consoles, right? Or at least on par.
At this point, it always was better. At this point, at least, in the generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, look, going back to, I don't know, 1060, you'd be doubling console performance usually. I mean, it's, your 30 FPS games on PS4 would be 60 on PC, and that's kind of the way it should be. I don't really get this whole thing about pegging, marketing a GPU as, it's a 1080p card. It's a 1440p card.
Super weird.
It's down to the user what kind of screen they've got and what GPU is best suited for it. I mean, Alex, basically, I think every single GPU comparison you've done for this entire generation to date has been an 8 gigabyte card
at 1440p.
At 1440p, right? Because it works. You get good performance, typically faster than the console on a decent port. So yeah, that doesn't really work for me. But well, who knows?
There we go.
Lots to talk about with 4060 and 4060 Ti, but not yet. We need to see some firm numbers at this point, and I suspect the numbers will be pretty good, right? Not spectacular, but absolutely fine for the price point. It's just going to be those banana skin new releases that require weeks/months to get into shape. Yeah,
that's the situation. It's a good segue to the next topic, actually.
Yeah, well, Beth Salvi is a slightly concerned 4070 owner, and I'm a slightly concerned 4060 Ti reviewer. More than slightly, actually. Okay, so let's move on to our next news topic, which isn't really a news topic as such, more an observation of the general state of play with gaming at the moment. And it's something that you were quite passionate about including in this Direct, because things are not going well, are they, John?
No, fundamentally, that's the thing that's really revealing about all this. Like, you guys are discussing all these situations, and the 8 gigabyte VRAM, TLU, Jedi patch, all of this relates to the fact that these users are having a bad day one experience. And this is happening more and more at a time when I feel like it absolutely should not be, specifically because games have become so expensive to make and they require so much time, right? So you have let's say you have a PC game releasing now like Jedi. It comes out, day one experience is bad. The word of mouth spreads, right? This game took X number of years to develop, certain amount of money. It's out there now. Obviously, that word of mouth does have an influence, and there are going to be people that do not purchase the game because, it doesn't run well, or they're trying to refund it, right? But then once they've already missed that boat, there's a good chance they may not come back to it until it shows up in a sale, like some year or so later, or even sooner. And it just gets into this cycle of waiting because you can't expect to have a good day one experience there. But we're also seeing this stuff on consoles as well, where games are just launching in a rough state, and then you don't have to wait long for them to go on sale, right? So it's kind of despite the massive increase in production costs, publishers are almost discouraging people from playing the game on day one because of launching in a bad state plus very quick sales, which is kind of that's kind of been Nintendo's secret, I think, is like their games don't really go on sale for, or at least not for a very, very, very long time. So you kind of just shrug and say, well, if I want to play this, like I'm going to be paying the same right now versus like a year or two from now, so may as well just get it. But that's not the case with the big AAA stuff. But that also ties into, like, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, games as a service and where that's going. And we've seen what's happened to major games as a service releases. Many of them have failed or were in the process of failing. We've seen like big investments on that. And I still liken this to a slot machine or like a gambling problem where publishers see the amount of money that can be made with like a Destiny or a very successful service game. And they want that money so bad. They want it so bad. And they're going to invest so much to get there. That means like years of development for these guys. You know, the amount of support needed to keep one of these things running, like it's just huge investment. But the reality is that most don't succeed. And most of them eventually close or just, you know, they can't support the investment that's gone into it. And that really concerns me, right? It just feels unhealthy to have all these very expensive multi-year development games coming out like this. And, man, I just don't know what this means for the future. And that also just comes into, related to this, just the cost of production is so high and the amount of time it takes to make these games. There are exceptions. There's games, you know, studios like Insomniac, I would say, you know, Remedy's done pretty good with this, where they're able to turn around games at a relatively quick pace, ship stuff out that's pretty solid at launch, and, you know, people really enjoy it. But it feels like big stuff is just taking so long to make. Like, I wonder how this works long term, right? Can a studio that takes 6 years to make a game with those huge modern costs and effort, can they really continue to thrive if that game fails? Right? Like, I don't know. I mean, if they have enough investment behind them, sure, but like it just feels like that's such a bad place to be. And like the expectations for games are reaching this point where people want so much from them, or they expect so much, and it's so hard to deliver it that it just doesn't seem healthy. But then you see something like Zelda on the Switch, which is a technical masterpiece for the Switch, I would say, but it has its fair share of issues. It feels visually like a game from 10 years ago in many ways, despite the excellent art direction, but people are still loving it, right? So it does make me think again, like, do we really need everything to be targeting these super big budget AAA production values? Like, yes, people expect it, but like, not everybody can be a Naughty Dog, right? Or, you know, a top, or the Coalition, or one of those studios that's able to push that stuff out, and they built their whole brand on that. But I feel like these attempts to try for it are dangerous long term for a lot of developers. But so I don't know. That's just kind of a random spiel I had in mind, but I'm curious to see what you guys think. Agree, disagree? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, I've got some thoughts here. First of all, yeah, we've moved on from the concept that a gold master is actually final code. It's not. It's kind of like a placeholder until launch day. Then day one, you get a patch which, as we've seen in recent times, hasn't actually addressed core issues. And that's problematic, right? Because you're right, John, the day one experience is crucial. If you have a poor experience on day one, then, you know, that's bad news.
That's bad.
Because, you know, people basically allocate, okay, right, I'm going to take some time off to play Jedi Survivor. You know, they're really looking forward to it. And then they have that crashing experience on day one. That's not great. The other thing is that, are things going to change? Because Jedi Survivor, you could arguably say that those console versions were good enough, quote unquote, on day one. I mean, it's not good enough for you, But a lot of people had a great time with Jedi Survivor. A lot of people are out there saying it's okay if you're on the quality mode, which is the default, I believe.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there is this kind of good enough mentality. And for a game like Jedi Survivor, it should have had the time and the effort put in to make it just right on day one. You know, the developers should have ticked all of their boxes. I don't think they could say they did. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been, you know, we're on whatever it is, patch 5 now, cranky. It's really problematic, right? And it turns people off games if, you know, the day one experience isn't what it should be.
Versus like Zelda, man, which, you know, Zelda has some performance drops, of course, given the nature of the hardware, but you see the excitement around that. Like, just, it's like a cultural touchstone. Everybody jumped in, they're having fun. You've seen posts about it everywhere. Like, you don't see talk about bugs, issues, or whatnot.
Yeah, God of War, Ragnarok.
God of War as
one.
well. Yeah, that was super solid. But then again, also on the Nintendo side, you could also point to the fact that maybe it doesn't always impact sales. Like Pokemon, the most recent game, sold pretty much as well as Zelda, and most of the conversation around that early on was how broken it was.
Yeah,
it still is.
It is. It's still a piece of garbage, technically.
I don't know. And I think something else is, you know, there's definitely something going on with Unreal Engine. I think they need to set up like their own version of the advanced technology group that Microsoft has and Sony has, which is developer support, which is, you know, help these guys to actually make the games run well, because it's clear that some level of help and support is needed. I don't know whether something like that already exists, but we're not seeing the fruits of it if it does.
Even beyond just the performance side, though, just speaking with various developers over the last year or so, just the monumental task of building a game that really pushes the fidelity of Unreal Engine 5, like just generating those assets, putting it all together, making it work. Like the task has become so high at this point. It's so difficult. It's like climbing Everest every time. And it just seems to be getting worse in that regard, where like, how feasible is this long term to keep targeting this level of fidelity?
Good question. I mean, I do love obviously really good graphics in game. But I actually, one thing I've talked about John about this even this morning before we started is like, but I do not need the cinematic flair necessarily. Like, I actually don't need really big, incredible, like set piece driven cinematic sequences. And I haven't played Elden Ring to a great degree because I had issues with it at launch, and I don't own a Switch, so I won't be playing too much the new Zelda game. But I really respect their approach to game design, which seems much more feasible to make games about, because the fidelity is like halfway there. It's okay enough for some aspects. Pretty bad in Elden Ring.
The art's good in Elden Ring.
The art's good. The art we got really great art in both situations. Mm-hmm. Obviously, with like, I think a different developer behind the helm for the technical aspects of at least Elden Ring, it would be a much better game. But the whole point is that we have games that are at least not going for these like really like sacred cow fruity kind of things where they just want to have this cinematic masterpiece of AAA gaming where everything looks beautiful, and then you get into the gameplay and it's like really static scenes and a lack of simulation and dynamism, which I think is really more interesting, and something that we saw in the Xbox 360 PS3 gen, oddly enough, even more than we see now. Yeah. And I think that is a really wonderful path forward. And I hope it's a learning lesson from other developers when they look at the new Zelda and Elden Ring, and they say, actually, branching stories and user agency are more interesting and maybe also more technically feasible than having, some sort of movie personality actor in your game where you pay X amount of money for them and spend 12 months on the cinematic storyline. I think that's what I would like to see as a way out of this situation that John was talking about the budgets increasing.
But of course, that only touches on the single player stuff, and
multiplayer. I don't even know what to do about multiplayer.
Whole different
honestly.
world.
Yeah, that's an area I don't have much experience in, and I look at what's happening with Overwatch 2 right now, where there's a lot of backlash against the fact that the multiplayer experience is not so different in the second game anymore. And the fact that the market there is already crowded, I have no idea what to do about multiplayer.
We saw the Suicide Squad delay thing happen right on the heels of both bad reception and the Avengers basically getting killed off. The
Yeah, right.
Avengers are no more.
Yeah,
Another high budget games as a service failure.
What games as a disservice at that point. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a way to wrap up this discussion with a bow, and it's actually impossible, right? Because I think the pursuit of fidelity is not going to stop. I just think there needs to be more of a focus on polish, right? You can't put out a game that's unpolished. That's what's happening at the moment. Jedi Survivor is a beautiful game. It's amazing. It just shouldn't have. There should have been some hard and fast decisions made about whether it's actually ready to ship.
That's kind of the point I made with God of War Ragnarok last year. It's like, it didn't blow me away visually, right? It felt, it was very well done from an art perspective, but it wasn't pushing technology. But what they released was so polished and complete feeling that, it just worked. And I feel like that, not to say that achieving what they did is anything near easy, but it's more that they put the focus on the right aspect of that game to make it a very polished day one experience for everyone, which it was.
Okay. I guess that's all we can really talk about that for now, but there's certainly big discussions to be had there. And hopefully there will be some increase in the quality of these day one releases. But let's now move on to supporter Q&A. This is the part of the show where we discuss questions that have been put forward to us by supporters on the DF supporter program. And I'm going to kick off with this question from Alan. Let me get to the question.
Shout out to Alan.
Shout out to Alan. And it ties in with some statements made by Strauss Zelnick of Take-Two, who believes it's likely that we'll be seeing mid-generation console refreshes during the current cycle. And the question is, hi DF team, ! Do you really think there is a need for PS5 Pro, Xbox X Pro when there has been scant true Gen 9 only games so far after 2 years? If there is to be a Pro version, how many years away do you think they are? Surely if they are released before 2026, wouldn't Gen 9 be considered a failure? So our existing sort of statements on this has been we don't actually really need them because we've yet to tap into this console generation. My position on that is kind of changing for a number of reasons, but I'll talk about it in a minute. John, do you think we need to have these new consoles? And if so, when?
I still kind of feel like we do not need it at this point, just given the long development cycles. And it just feels wrong at this point. Like it feels like this generation is still starting. Like we just haven't seen much from them. It kind of makes these boxes feel like it was a weird stopgap somehow. And I can understand the points in favor of mid-gen consoles, but I don't know, from a consumer perspective, it just feels like the wrong move. Like the solution to the issues right now is not more hardware, right? And I think, not that I want them to follow in the footsteps of Nintendo on this front, but I do think the Switch kind of demonstrates this in effect, right? Nintendo's been sitting on this thing for a long time, and yeah, it's getting a little crusty, but the Switch is still selling like hotcakes, right? And I don't, PS5 is selling very well right now, and I feel like some people might feel burnt by Sony or Microsoft if suddenly like, oh, now there's another new console coming out and your console's now out of date. Specifically with the PS5 though, I would actually just prefer to see a slim model at this point as opposed to like a whole new machine, just because the current PS5 is so gigantic and kind of ugly. So
yeah.
But yeah.
Alex, do you think there should be mid-generation refreshes?
I would say no, because I've just been watching the AAA releases just go into Awfulville. And I think a part of that is just that they're supporting too many platforms and they don't have enough time. And I just I want their burdens to be lessened over time as the generation starts going and not all of a sudden kick up again because they have to support other boxes. That would be them supporting PS5, PS5 Pro, Xbox Series Z, I don't know what they're going to call it, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, and then the PC platform. And maybe because their publisher thinks so, it's also going to be releasing on last gen. Like I want simplicity. I want games to come out better, not and we've barely tapped into the new gen. Like the person saying this, Alan, there's been so few current gen only releases. It's been so not good in that regard. So I'm not a fan of the mid-gen refresh currently at all.
But Alex, is Awfulville like the follow-up song to Margaritaville from Jimmy Buffett?
It is. It's the morning after, actually.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. It's like the end of the album. Kick it off with Margaritaville, end with Awfulville.
Wow. We've sort of veered into discussions on various vills, which is quite interesting. Well, there's the pragmatic me says that there's no need for these boxes to come about because, well, when you look at the generational leap that will be provided by Unreal Engine 5 with Lumen and Nanite, that has still yet to actually arrive. And we've got Immortals of Avium coming soon, which should give us some indication of how this is all going to shake out. But yes, I mean, essentially we are still using the same sort of techniques that we used in prior generations. And when you actually push those existing technologies into doing things that are really advanced, you get something like Jedi Survivor, which looks amazing, but clearly the foundational engine there isn't really up to scratch. So I hope to see Unreal Engine 5 sort of produce a level of spectacle that actually starts to justify these current generations beyond higher resolutions and 60 FPS. But at the same time, I don't think that the concept of the current console generation is actually going to remain with us. Sony were well behind it when I was talking to Mark Cerny about it, he was directly saying they're wedded to the concept of console generations, but then most of their titles, first party titles, came out cross-gen. I think we're going to stay in cross-gen. And if there are going to be mid-generation refreshes, it will just be like more capable versions of the machines that we've currently got, which will appeal to a certain part of the audience. And maybe we'll see a gradual transition, right? I mean, this isn't a discussion that's going to go away anytime soon. I obviously think that there probably will be some kind of mid-generation refresh, but it could simply be something along the lines of Xbox One S, where the core hardware remains the same, but they take the opportunity to add quality of life improvements to the silicon, or maybe a feature that could, improve matters. I don't think it would be beyond the realms of, it wouldn't break developers if there was an AI block in the new console, which actually takes care of upscaling for you in a much better way than current solutions.
I agree with that. I think that would be the best use case for these sort of upgraded machines, is just sort of like value adds like that improves the overall experience, even though it's still generally similar. If it just means more frames, better image quality, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That would be super nice and useful.
Let's move on to the next question. This one from Tom Bomb. Hi, DF crew! Exclamation point. So far, we've only had a handful of games that support 40 FPS this generation. After trying it in Ratchet and Clank and seeing how awesome it plays, I think that's a shame. Do you think games like Callisto Protocol, Redfall, or Jedi Survivor would benefit from a 40 FPS mode if 60 FPS is too hard to hit or requires too many compromises? Do you have any hopes we'll see these games and more support 40 FPS? John, what do you think about this? Because I'll tell you what, Plague Tale shipped with 40 FPS and people just relentlessly harassed the developer until they implemented a 60 FPS mode.
Well, I mean, that situation is dumb. Those people.
Yes.
But I do think I would love to see more support for 40 frames per second. And I think part of the problem and the reason we see it so little is that there's a misunderstanding over what it means, right? We've explained this before, where if you look at the frame time graph, it is directly in between 30 FPS and 60 FPS, right? It's this perfect middle ground. But when you just say 40 frames per second to the layman, or even to developers that haven't really thought deeply about it, it doesn't sound like a big deal, right? It's something that you've got to see and experience. I have spoken with developers that were like, that doesn't seem that interesting, and then they would actually give it a shot and be like, oh, actually this is better than I had expected, right? And I think that's the general case with it, is that we need more people to experience it and want to implement it. But at the same time, again, as you know, it does require a 120 hertz capable display, and not everybody is using one of them, right? And I mean, I don't know if they have metrics on this stuff, like to determine how many people are using displays capable of supporting this feature. But I could see a developer thinking like perhaps it doesn't make sense to implement this here just because of that fact, because the user base is low. I still think they should though, because that's something that would make that makes a lot of sense for a high end console, is to offer flexibility like that. But I don't know. It seemed to have caught on with a lot of Sony first party games, but we're not seeing it much elsewhere. And that's a bummer.
Do you think it's still the case that there's not actually enough 120 hertz screens out there?
I feel like at this point there has to be, right? It's been like 4 years or more of OLEDs supporting 4K 120, and even then, before that, you have displays that could still support 120, but maybe at 1440p or 1080p.
The reason I asked the question is obviously, looking at Twitter, which I'm not sure is a realistic representation of real life, but regardless, people were complaining about tearing in Jedi Survivor. I mean, in theory, they shouldn't be seeing tearing because VRR would be automatically active on their 120 hertz displays.
Hopefully. I think
maybe it's just not set up. I don't know.
There's a couple of games that don't work with VR. Like, didn't Horizon originally not work with VRR? Wasn't that a thing? Like on the PS5 side of things,
I thought it did.
I don't know. There were some.
Returnal did not, and Gran Turismo 7 did not. They do now, but they did not initially.
So given all the other issues with Jedi, maybe that is just another thing. Like the game is just not VRRing correctly on PS5. I would hope it is on Xbox, since it is like fully system level driven on that machine usually. But that is a weird one. I am also a little bit surprised it is not more common, the 40 FPS mode, because I would have thought 120 hertz screens have they're just more widely available at this point in time. More people are using them, because if you've upgraded a television in the last, John was saying, like 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah, it's probably 120 hertz for a lot of those screens.
Your old Samsung, that was 1440p at 120 hertz, right?
Was also not expensive. It was only on the lower end models that were sub 48 inch, sub 50 inch that were not.
I've actually
60.
got that one in my bedroom.
Yeah, right. So like so maybe on the ultra, like on the lower end for televisions, maybe this is not as common, but at least for the mid to upper end range, it's been 120 for a while.
I mean, I do hope we see more 40 FPS games, to get back to Tom Bob's question, but I'm not sure we'll see them in Callisto, Redfall, or Jedi Survivor.
No, I don't think so.
Because, the die has been cast, so to speak, there. That those games have shipped. Also, great to see them added, but
in the case of Callisto Protocol, that game with ray tracing enabled is pretty heavy, and and if you recall, I mean, especially on Xbox, it definitely had issues maintaining 30 FPS in all scenes. So I'd imagine their overhead isn't high enough to allow a stable 40 FPS mode, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Smart.
Let's move on to the next question. This one from Mendo Shutaro. Opinions on the Layers of Fear PC demo. It's UE5, but you wouldn't really know it. LOD pops galore, assets are pretty low poly, and of course traversal stutters all over the place. And it's a corridor game.
It is a corridor game.
Also broken HDR, tone mapped by the looks of it and not well, and no ultra-wide support. Pretty weak showing for the first third-party UE5 title. So Alex, maybe... Yeah, there was R-Type, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And Fortnite. Actually, no, that's
Fortnite.
First party.
That's first party.
But Alex, you took a look at this one, and it is a pretty weak showing for a first third party, or not first.
For an initial, one of the first.
But it's not actually using the UE5 features, is it?
Yeah, it's got the UE 5.1, I believe, engine number, if you look at the EXE or whatever, or one of the system files. But obviously UE5 is just a name. The technologies are iteratively added onto UE4's base in a lot of ways. So you can still use old UE4 tech just the same, and it has legacy support because it needs legacy support, because the whole idea was you have an Unreal Engine 4 title and you want to actually engine update it, your project file into UE5, which is possible. So this is what it looks like to me. I think Layers of Fear was designed around Unreal Engine 4 and upgraded to Unreal Engine 5 at some point. It's a blooper joint. And it seems like that. The person saying this, I also saw all the same LED pop-ups. I also saw that the assets were surprisingly low poly for a game that you would have thought maybe Nanite would have been used. And interestingly, the thing that gave me a really big hint that this was just kind of like UE5 in name only is that there's a ray tracing toggle. And that's not actually how the menu is set up in UE5. It's set up between lighting quality and reflection quality, and you can toggle them on and off, and below high, it turns on SDF, AO, and SSR, respectively. So that's the way the menus should be set up in a UE5 game, and this one obviously wasn't. It has a ray tracing toggle, which seems to only affect reflections on ridiculously mirror-like surfaces in a big way, and they don't even look that great. So it was a bit sad for an original title. And the one thing that did make me also sad, like you, Mondo, is that I did notice for the fact that like the game is really, I don't know, it actually reminds me of like a hallway in Metal Gear Solid 2 or Resident Evil like 1 or 2, where it's just like literally the hallways rendering and that's it. You can't even see outside the windows really. And it still has like minor traversal stutters, and that is just like
it kind of reminded me of the first Unreal Engine 4 game, if you recall, Daylight.
Oh, Daylight, yeah.
Which was that it was also this corridor horror game that it looked pretty bad, to be honest. But the jump from UE3 to UE4, there were pretty significant differences in sort of the basic rendering techniques. You could tell it was different, where this just looks, this is just a port or to the most recent version of Unreal Engine 5, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's what it must be. And we should expect a lot better. I think Immortals of Avium at this point would have been the thing. I've already blocked out the time for it. I'm making sure I'm here for DF when that game comes out, because I'm going to be covering it. But this week, originally, I wasn't going to be looking at The Last of Us. I was originally going to be doing UE5 coverage, but I had trouble. UE 5.2 is just not working well in a certain aspect to make a video on it. And this title, which I also would have maybe covered in the video, is just not UE5 really in a big way. So
yeah, you posted some screenshots in the Slack channel, and it was like, does the world need a video by Alex Battaglio about this title?
No, I laughed so hard when you post that ray. It's like, look, ray tracing on and off, and I couldn't stop focusing on the reflection of the character model, which looked horrendous. It looked like a 15-year-old character model.
Yeah, it did not look good.
It's like, maybe I don't want ray tracing on in this game.
Dear. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from SJ33 in brackets Jake. Alex.
Hey, Jake.
Hi, Jake.
Hey, Jake.
Hi, all. Rich has spoken before about rethinking how to approach CPU reviews. I'd be interested to know what thoughts and ideas that everyone has regarding this. I love Will's written reviews, of course, but the video reviews have been sorely missed with the most recent generations of GPUs. Yeah, I hear you on that, and I'd love to have reviewed those CPUs. And I'm still thinking about this, but still tricky. So what do? Benchmarks are not particularly representative of the CPU experience in any given game, because the task of the CPU changes radically during the game, right? I'm not a fan of lowering resolutions down to nothing in order to isolate CPU performance, because it's not a realistic use case scenario for those CPUs. You're kind of artificially generating a result, but it does at least give you some idea of representative deltas between various CPUs, right? So the idea that I'm thinking of is basically you would build up a suite of games where we have, like Alex has just done with Jedi Survivor, found a really egregiously poor area of a game. And then rather than just running at unlocks, you would run it with various CPU limits. And because I think at this point, the concept of playing a game fully unlocked is for the birds. It's just not really a good idea, because you get such wild variance that it just doesn't make sense, right? However, if if you were going to be testing, like, for example, Jedi Survivor with let's say, 13400F, which is CPU I'm working with at the moment, you would set maybe, 60, 90, 120, or, the refresh rates of displays. So I guess that would be 60, 120, 144. And then you would basically set your frame rate limit at the refresh rate. And rather than sort of measuring performance fully unlocked, you would be introducing a limit there in order to get a consistent experience. And you could say, okay, for the 13400F, Jedi Survivor, yeah, that's a 60 hertz game and it runs pretty well. At least then you've got some real life indication of what the CPUs, how the CPUs would compare. And it's like, okay, if I've got a 120 hertz screen, well, this data is telling me I actually need a 13700F or whatever. And, you would basically have like, sort of, lines in the ground as to where you would get a smooth, consistent experience. Because I think that's the premium at the moment, right?
Yeah.
There's stutter all over the place for varying levels of reasons, right? And, what tasks does the CPU do? It's very rare that you actually run completely CPU limited, but actually it turns out, you can be quite easily these days. The other thing I'm finding with this combination of a 13400 and a 4070 is that you can actually be CPU limited in practically any AAA game if you're using DLSS, which is another thing to factor in, of course. Low internal resolutions are actually becoming more important now because DLSS is, basically shifting the goalposts in what the GPU is actually doing. Gotham Knights, for example, I'm finding with the 13400F that, 4070 is on like 50% utilization. It's crazy stuff happening in the CPU space at the moment. So that's kind of the idea that I've had. And I think that I'm still not happy enough to go with it as a review sort of methodology. But at some point, we've got to figure out the meaningful role of the CPU in gaming and try to review around that. This has come across probably a lot more confused than I think it should be, Alex. But what do you think?
I like your idea a lot. And I think you were talking about 60, 120, 144. And what you do is the key thing is the gradual. So you would look at the performance at those respective refresh rates and frame rates. And the idea is to think about the variance from that frame rate, either on a per frame basis as a frame time graph or as a frame rate graph, which is slightly less interesting because frame rate graphs are averages and don't show the interesting aspect of the fact that one CPU could be 60 FPS with, one frame taking X amount of milliseconds and the rest being a lot shorter versus one frame being 60 milliseconds and all 60 frames per second and all the frames being 16.6 milliseconds. So I think really frame health is the really interesting part. Frame health at respective refresh rates and frame rates. Yeah. And what that looks like in terms of review is a little bit hard, but I think it is a hardcore focus on the frame time graph.
The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that with VRR displays, essentially, it doesn't need to be 60, 120, 144. Right. It can be anything. So I actually think, 90 is a really good sweet spot for gaming, which would actually ease up load on the CPU quite significantly and the GPU. The other thing is the whole concept of frame rate as a metric, which we've talked about in the past. We just talked about how 40 FPS is kind of, doesn't really represent the experience because the frame time is actually midway between 30 and 60. So you would actually expect the experience to be more like 45 frames per second, right? Which is the midpoint in frame rate terms. Crazy things happen the higher you get on frame rate because you're just subdividing a moment of time exponentially higher when your actual frame time variance becomes, diminishingly low. It's crazy stuff. The difference between 120 and 144 frames per second sounds a lot, but it's like 1 and a bit milliseconds per frame. I reckon most people wouldn't be able to tell the difference, and that's kind of the reason why this idea of frame health with a specific frame rate limit actually has a lot more value to it, because a consistent experience is much more pleasing at a lower level, is much more pleasing than, an experience that's unstable but is generally running at a higher frame rate.
I agree with that. I think we all do at DF, almost everyone.
But we need to find a way to make it a lot more easy to understand. And maybe it is just having a flat line, and the more variations there are below the flat line, the less capable the CPU is, and then it scales up as we increase the frame rate limit.
We do have, it's interesting, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, John, just really quickly. We do have, for example, frame tear indicators, right? And what if there was a frame tear indicator that, the equivalent level of indicator for the frame time graph, which then at the moment when the frame time goes, say, for example, 2x or 3x, or maybe just a little bit more out of a norm that we would consider visible in a bad way, that would show up as like a red dot there or something on the line, like, oh, the more red dots you have plotted over your frame time graph for the bench is a worse experience than,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's some way to like encapsulate that visually.
I think so. Yeah. Did you have anything to add to that, John?
No, I was just chuckling at the idea of frame health, and like typically when a patient is hooked up to a machine and their vitals are monitored, you have like the sort of the line, right? And that showcases that they're still alive. When you flatline, it's game over. But frame health, it's the inverse, right? You want that flat line. It's like as soon as you start seeing those variances, then it's time to the patient's in trouble.
I think they need to put a proof of concept video together to see whether it actually works as a concept, and see what people think of it. But let's move on to the next question. This one from Greg Brown. Alex's recent control patch video was the first HDR one in a while. Has the workflow and capture experience improved at all since y'all were trying it out a few years back? And on a related note, are there any games this gen you'd like to call out for having excellent HDR, or would think about showcasing that way in the future? So Alex, we used to do HDR videos. They got really complicated. YouTube's tone mapper was crap, and we just sort of thought it wasn't worth the effort. First of all, workflow and capture, how did that work out with Control?
It was much better. So a big part of the reason why it was much better is because Premiere, which is our editing software, other than if you're Oliver, is much better in HDR these days. It used to be previously that you would have to literally buy another monitor. Like, for example, John has, or even Richard has what are they called? Those monitors that you plug in the
Atomos devices.
The Atomos, and you'd have to buy the equivalent of a Atomos device, which could be plugged into Premiere, and then would use it as the preview monitor in a different color space above Rec 709. Nowadays, Premiere just supports all their color spaces by default. So it's got HLG Rec 2020, it's got PQ Rec 2020 as well, and a couple others. And so you can actually now, with a consumer HDR monitor and or television, preview your HDR footage on the timeline in a way that matches what you should see. And you can also change the color space willy-nilly if you want and see it in a different color space. It's pretty interesting. That made it so much better. Also, the basic, when I originally did a video on the Special K HDR modding years ago, that all of the things inside Premiere that weren't the color space of the video were all still SDR graded. So nothing was the proper nit level when you would export a video. It's still not great in that aspect because everything just exports at like full brightness at white, which is not great. So I had to come up with a method I just changed the opacity and added in a lot of heavy shadowing behind elements that were not there so that they would relief better against the footage. So those things are all better. And on the recording side of things, I found that, I still it still could maybe be better because it doesn't plug in with our tools, but I was using actually now RE Central, which by default now has an HDR recording aspect to it where it saves in main 10, HEVC, really easy to edit on the timeline because it's timeline accelerated in Premiere now. So it's super fast, 4K HDR, super fast on the timeline. That is the really great part. The only aspect that I didn't find so great about it is recording in HDR necessitated that I really couldn't use our tools in a good way with it. And because I was using RE Central, RE Central, like OBS, I do not trust any of the things it's saying about whether it's dropping frames or not. I don't trust any of that. It's just BS. It says it's maybe fine, but then you watch the footage later and it's like, actually, it's been dropping frames. So that was my other issue with RE Central, is sometimes I'd see drop frames and I wasn't really sure why. So I'd restart the recording or restart the program at that point. Unlike with, we use VDub 2, it is 100% always accurate if there's drop frames. It's so good. So that was the best part. And I also thought when I published it on YouTube now, I was generally shocked about the quality of how it looked on YouTube. I was watching it through Edge browser, which supports HDR really easily, and it looked good in HDR, and the SDR tone map was really good. I thought it looked great. And the interesting part about HDR footage on YouTube is that the bit rate is a lot higher. So actually at 1080p, the video looked really good, which is completely different than 1080p YouTube usually. So I was actually really happy with it. I would love to do it again. I also found out some really fun ways to, which I'm not sure you can do on console so much so, but to insert SDR footage into the video is to abuse Windows's internal SDR grading in an HDR container by changing the brightness level. And for example, for all of the like video files that we use, like the ones I use, like for the bell, ring the bell, and I use for the Patreon video, all I did was re-record them using NVIDIA Share on the desktop, running in an SDR HDR container with modified brightness, and they looked perfect in the exported video, which was really interesting because otherwise they'd be SDR beforehand, be 100 nits and be really dark. So there were some like really fun things that I learned while doing that. I think I would love to do in the future, but we'll see how much I can cover it, because it's once again on the list of so many things that I can cover in a PC port video. It's just another thing to add in, and I don't have infinite time. So.
Yeah, it's another failure point as well, potentially,
yeah.
Because unless you actually see what you're editing. I mean, when we were doing HDR editing back in the day, it was all in an SDR format, and it was all grey and washed out until we actually exported it and then patched the export with HDR metadata. It was a nightmare.
Do you remember that during that initial time, a lot of people got tripped up at E3 that year?
Yes, with the Forza Motorsport.
With the Forza stuff. Like, you saw big channels posting footage
of it.
Just like that raw, like SDR versions of HDR content. So it's all grey and washed out and horrible looking. And there was like an emergency meeting with Microsoft to be like, what can we do to fix this? Like this.
Yeah, crazy stuff. I mean, I really would like to transition to HDR fully, but it's just so many workflow considerations and potential failure points.
Well,
that video
also,
was
Rich,
fantastic, Alex.
the second part of that question touches on, are there any games that you like to call out for having excellent HDR? And the problem is, I don't think there's that many as of late.
Really?
Like, the HDR implementations have been largely okay, but I have not been blown away by many. I mean, Gran Turismo 7 is one of them, but most games, I feel like the older games I've looked at in the past, like Crackdown 3, Gears 5, the 2 GT games, those are still like among the best that we've ever seen. And most games releasing don't touch them in terms of quality. And that's a shame.
Absolutely.
I don't feel like HDR adds as much to the experience as it should in many cases.
Interesting.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's move on to the final question from Lord.Frosty. Hey, DF crew, simple question. John's room tour. When?
Oh, man, That's a tough one. If people really want to see that, I can probably do something like that. It's just hard to film.
Can we do it like MTV Crib style, where like you're like outside your house and it's like Dutch angles all the time, and you're like going like this, like, come into my house. Let's do it.
If you come and visit me, Alex, we'll try shooting some MTV Crib style stuff here. Just make sure you're constantly turning the camera and I'm getting up with it, and like
can't you just use the Premiere camera shake filter?
No, it doesn't. It's not. No,
it's not nearly as awesome.
It's not as accurate.
Yeah.
Oh dear. So well, yeah, I think it certainly is a Patreon bonus. Everyone would love to see your room.
I need to really maybe showcase the setup as well, like how it all works, because the wiring between everything I have in here is really complicated.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I can show pretty much anything on every monitor in the room if I want, and that's it takes a lot of work to get this stuff going, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screens in this room alone.
So you're
my
kind of like the DF equivalent of the architect in the Matrix
A
Reloaded.
little bit, yeah.
Ergo.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, good stuff. But that's the final question and therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, ring the bell for notionally instant notifications. Notification update. I am now getting notifications from channels I am not actually subscribed to.
Really?
And the ones I am subscribed to and where the bell has been rung.
I'm also seeing this
nothing.
behavior. I keep getting notifications for recommended channels on YouTube now.
Yeah, and they're certainly not recommended. Let's put it that way.
Ever since I came back from the US, I keep getting recommended videos about guns and like shooting guns, and you're like, look how big this is. I'm gonna blow up this thing with this huge. It's like, okay. So popping up all over,
Oh, that's amazing.
and I can't stop watching them now. Now the algorithm got me. I'm just watching that stuff all day now.
Yes, sorry about that. DF Supporter Program, join us for early access bonus materials, the chance to help shape every week's Direct, and of course the chance to see the Direct early every single week. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.